In the last lesson, we talked about the problems of JSP scripting elements. The solution is to separate out Java code from JSP, and there are three ways to do it: using servlets, Java beans, and custom tag libraries. In this lesson, we'll discuss Java beans. Bean is an overused term in Java, I guess because it sounds cool with Java being coffee and everything. Under different contexts, bean means different things in Java. For example, there's GUI component Java bean, which was probably where the term bean originated. And then there's something called enterprise Java bean. In the context of Java web programming, when people talk about bean, they usually mean a regular Java object that is used for modeling data. The guestbook entry class is actually a very typical bean class. It's just a normal standalone Java class that does not depend on servlet or any other API. And because of this, Java beans are often called POJOs, or plain old Java objects. The most important thing about a bean is its properties. Bean properties are defined by getters and setters. Note that properties and class variables are not the same thing. For example, in this user class, we have three properties defined by three getters. First name, last name, name, defined by getFirstName, getLastName, and getName. Notice that the class only has two variables or fields, but it has three properties because the properties are defined by getters and or setters. Bean properties and getters and setters must follow some naming convention. In particular, the first letter of a property should always be lowercase. For example, lowercase f, l, and n. And that first letter must be capitalized in the getter and setter. For example, here, capitalize F, L, and N. Sometimes a property only has a getter, and that property is called a read-only property. Like in the user class, all three properties are read-only properties. Properties that only has setters are called write-only properties, and property having both getter and setter are called read-write properties. For example, the three properties in guestbook entry, ID, name, and message, are all read-write properties because each property has both getter and setter. Now that we know the basics about bean properties, let's check out this example. So, what properties does this class foobar has? First of all, ignore the fields. Remember that properties are defined by getters and setters, not the fields or class variables. And so let's look at this getter and setter first. So we have a get A and then a set A, and that would make A a read-write property. So A would be a property. Notice that the property name is a lowercase a, where A is capitalized in getter and setter. This is a naming convention, and the property names are case sensitive, so make sure that you remember it's lowercase. So for B, there's a getter for B, there's no setter for B. So B would be a read-only property. Again, this would be a lowercase b. And for C, there's a setter, no getter, so C is a write-only property. Again, remember it's lowercase c. AB, there's only getter, no setter, so it's read-only, and notice that the property name is actually lowercase a and uppercase b. And that's, again, the property naming convention. Now, if we look at E, notice that E has a setter, set E, and instead of get E, we have something here which is is E. Now, for most properties, getter has a form of get, then the property name with the first letter capitalized. But for Boolean properties like E, there's a special rule that says that the getter would be named as is property instead of get property, and that's only for Boolean properties. So is E is actually the getter for E, and for Boolean property is instead of get. So we have a getter for E, we have a setter for E, so E again would be a read-write property. Notice the special rule for the name for a getter of a Boolean property. So notice that we have A, B, C, D, E in our class field, but because properties are defined by getters and setters, we don't have a property D, even though we have a D variable here. And also, although we don't have a variable here AB, we do have a property AB here. Again, this is the difference between class variables and properties, which are defined by getters and setters. Now let's look at another example. So if we take a quick look at this example, we may be thinking that this foobar class would have four properties: read-write property A, read-only property B, write-only property C, and write-only property D. However, if we take a closer look, it turns out that we don't have that many properties. In fact, most of those are not actually properties. For example, if we look at get A and set A, it looks like a getter for A, then a setter for A. But it turns out that it's not the case. Notice that the getter returns an int value, and the setter takes a string argument. In Java, properties have types just like variables, and the property type needs to be consistent in both getter and the setter. So you cannot have a getter that returns an integer type, but the setter taking a string type. So this, in fact, is not a property. And if you try to use A as a property in your code, you will get an exception that says cannot determine the type of property A or something like that. So remember, getter and setter must have the same type for the property. Now if we look at this B, although it looks like a getter for property B, it is actually not, because a getter should not have any argument, and this method actually has an argument here. So this one is not a getter, so B is not a property either. And for similar reasons, C is not a property because we have two arguments for the setter, and a setter should have no argument. So C is not a property either. And D is actually okay. So this is a proper setter for D. Did I say, sorry, I forgot if I said setter should have no argument. Setter should have one argument, and this one has two. So that's why C is not a property. And for D, this one is a proper setter because it only has one argument. And notice that the variable D is declared as an integer, but here it shows that the property D is a string, and that's okay, as long as it follows the proper requirement for setter, and properties are defined by getters and setters, so they have little to do with the class variables. And in this case, D is indeed a property, and it is a write-only property. So to summarize, a getter must have no argument, a setter must have exactly one argument, and the type of a property must be consistent in both the getter and the setter. Now that we know bin and bin property, let's see how we can use bins in JSP. To use a bin in a JSP page, we first need to declare the bin using a special type, JSP use bin. To get the value of a bin property in JSP, we use the tag JSP get property. And similarly, we use JSP set property to set the value of a bin. There are also a couple of other ways to access bin properties. In the next lesson, we'll see how to use expression language to get the value of a bin property and how to use the custom tag cset to set a property value. Here are the three special tags and their attributes. For use bin, we have class, ID, and scope. And for get property, we have name property. And for set property, we have four attributes: name, property, value, and param. We'll use some examples to see what these attributes mean. Let's say that we want to use a bin to control the background color of a web page. Let's create that web page first. So let's say we create a JSP file, and I'm going to call it bgcolor.jsp. And let's put a little content there. This is JSP. Okay, so to set the color, to set the background color of a JSP, we can use background. And if I remember correctly, that is RGB some value. So if we want, for example, red, that will be 255 and 0 and 0. Let's see if this thing works. No, I want to call it BG color, not GB color. BG as in background. Okay. GB color.jsp. No, BG. Okay, so we have a JSP with a red background, and if I change this to 255 here, RGB, so this one would be green. No, it's green. Right? So this is how we can set the background color of a web page. And now we want to control this background using a bin. Let's create a bin, and I'm going to call the bin BG bin. And inside the bin, I'll have three integers R, G, and B. And we would want to have a constructor which initialize we initialize the default value for R, G, and B, and so let's say by default the background will be red. So R is 255, green and blue are both 0, and then let's use Eclipse to generate the getters and setters. So you can see we have RGB here, select all, and it generates get R, set R, get G, set G, get B, set B, right? And those are our getters and setters. So now we have our bin. Again, it's a very simple Java class, a POJO with just regular Java class things. Getters and setters define 3 properties R and G and B. Okay, so we have a bin here, we have a JSP here. How do we connect them together? So we use JSP use bin. And so for use bin tag, there's a class, there's an ID. So we'll leave out scope for now. We'll get back to that later. And let's declare that bin here. So we'll say JSP use bin, and the ID can be anything. It's like the name of a variable. So I'm going to call it BG. And the class is, of course, the class of this bin class, and that will be CL320 model BG bin. So now we have included a bin in this JSP, but how do we use that? Well, that's where get property comes in, and in get property there are 2 attributes, name and property. Name is the name of the bin, and is actually the ID of the bin, and the property, of course, is the property name. So let's say that instead of hard coding RGB here, we'll say JSP get property name is BG, and property is R. Remember, R is lowercase. Okay, so this would give us the R component of the RGB getting the R value from the bin. So we'll do the same thing for G and B. So this would be G, and this would be B. And let's see how it looks. Let me change the title here. Where is the title? Here. This would be BG color. As we can see, the background now turns red, and that's because we set the initial red value to 255, and the green and the blue components are 0. And if we do a view source, we can see that it's showing the value of R, the value of G, the value of B, and that's what these 3 tags do. They get the value of R property and G property and then B property. To just make sure that the thing works correctly, let's change R to 0 and B to 255, save, and then refresh. Now, as you can see, the background is now blue, and that's because we have changed the background color in the bin. So this is a simple example from using bin to using bin's property values. The important thing about this example is to understand the tag useBin and getProperty. useBin creates a bin object for the JSP page and is equivalent to this Java statement. Note that the ID value is basically the variable name, and also note that because you cannot specify constructor arguments in the useBin tag, the bin class must have a constructor that takes no argument. So a constructor like this is important. The getProperty tag is quite straightforward. You specify the bin ID here and the property name here, and it returns a property value, just like when in Java you call the getter object. So saying bg.getR, which is equivalent to say bgPropertyR. Okay, so far so good, and then let's see how we can change property values using the tag JSP setProperty. And similar to getProperty, we need to specify the name or the ID of the bin, the name of the property, and then some value for that property. So the easiest way to set a property is to use the value attribute. And for example, by default, we have RG components being 0 and B component being 255, and that's why we're seeing blue background here. So let's say that we change the red component. Let's say we do a JSP setProperty. Name is BG, property is red, and value is 255. So what this one will do is it will set the R component to 55, and the blue components is still 255, and red plus blue, would it be purple? Well, it's kind of violet or pinkish. Anyway, so this is the color of red plus blue, and as we can see, we can change a property quite easily by using setProperty with a value. So what are the other attributes for setProperty do? In particular, what is this prime value? Well, what this prime attribute? So what this means is that instead of giving the property R a specific value like this one will set the value of the parameter R to this property. In other words, it takes the value of a request parameter and sets that value into this property. So for example, let's say that we'll do JSP setProperty, name is BG, and the property is G. So this time we'll add the green component, and we'll say param is green. So what this one says is that if there's a request parameter green, set the value of that request parameter to the green property, to the G property. So if we do a refresh, still the same thing because there's no green parameter. And if we set a green parameter, let's say we set green to 255 as well. All three components 255, that means white, and white it is. If it's 100, then it's a lighter pinkish color. And as you can see, once we connect request parameters with properties, now things becomes quite a bit interesting, because now we can control the background color, in this case dynamically, and that's great. So notice that here it says param being green, and so the request parameter must be called green. If we say this is G, it will not do anything. And for set property, there's also a shorthand form for property and param. So instead of saying set property with the value of a parameter, you can simply say set property. Now what this one means is that this one is equivalent to the second one. So this one basically says set the value of property R with the value of a parameter which has the same name as the property. So it will look for a parameter whose name is also R. And for that, we can do something like this. And we can simply remove this. So what this one means is, let's take the request parameter G and set its value to the property. So going back here, now if we use G, this would work again, because G parameter has the same name as the property. So this one means take the value of the parameter that have the same name and set it to this property. And let's see the last form of set property. So the last form is you can specify the property name as star. What this means is that it will set all the property values if they have corresponding request parameters that have the same name. And so set property star would be equivalent of setting property of A, B, and R and G and B if there are request parameters that matches their name. So let's do, actually let's get rid of, actually let's just change it to this one. So if we do that, G still works, but now we can also add R and B. So let's say we have R is 255 and green is also 255 and blue is 0. Red plus green, that should be yellow, and you can see that it is yellow now. And if we change, yeah, so it's more green than yellow. And so this form of set property is quite useful. It basically takes the property values and then look for request parameters that have the matching name, and then set the request parameter values to the property. And it's one line to set all the properties basically. Okay, so these are the several forms of set properties that we can use. You can set a value directly, you can set a value by request parameter, and by request parameter of the same name and by all the request parameters that matching the property names. Okay, so the last thing we want to talk about is the scope. For useBean, there's a scope attribute which can be either page or request or session or application. The page scope is the default scope. So if we don't specify the scope attribute, it's default to scope. It defaults to page scope. So what are these scopes? Remember when we talked about application scope and the session scope when we discussed servlets, and they mean exactly the same thing as before. Application scope means data in the scope is valid throughout the lifecycle of the web application. Data in the session scope is valid throughout the session. And now we have two new scopes, request and page. Request scope means data is valid throughout the processing of the request, and page scope means the data is only valid within the current page. So let's use an example to see the differences of these scopes. So this is our BG color JSP. Let's change it a little bit. Let's say we get rid of the rest and just leave this one set property which use the star form to set all the properties. And BGBean, let's change default color back to red. And let's refresh. So this is red, no request parameters, default color in the bean, everything's fine. Now let's create another JSP and we'll call it bgcolor2.jsp. So in this bgcolor2.jsp, we don't include any set property. So in this JSP page, it's only using whatever property values in the BGBean. Let's change this to this is bgcolor2 using only color in the bean BG. Okay, so we have BG color and BG color 2 having the same color, which is as expected. And now let's open up another browser here. So BG color 2, same color, no surprise here. Now let's say that we change the BG colors background, and this time we add a green component. So this background becomes yellow. Now if we refresh here, this background remains red, and this one is yellow. And this is as expected, because notice that the scope of the bean has we have no scope attribute here, meaning that the scope of the bean is page. That means that the bean is only affecting the current page. So obviously a different page, it will be a different bean. So this bean is red, this bean is yellow, and this bean, it's red. So no surprise there. And similarly, if we open another browser and check the color, background color, and again it will be the default background red, and this one is yellow, everything's fine. Now let's change the scope of the bin to something else. Let's say that the scope of this bin is now session. So what this one means is basically that we are now going to save this bin in the session scope. Remember that the session scope data is shared by all the servlets, and they have if they are in the same session, they will access the same data, and it's the same thing for JSP. So let's add scope to session also to BG color 2. Okay, so now let's say we set this background to yellow, and now let's remove the parameter and refresh this page. Notice that this color remains yellow, and that's because the bin is now in session scope and is valid throughout the session. So even this time we are not specifying the request parameter, the previous color remains because they are still in session. And now if we refresh here, notice that now BG color 2 also gets a color because it's sharing the same bin inside the session scope. So now this one also has a color. However, different browser, if we refresh here, notice that the color remains red because this browser is using a different session than this browser. So that's the difference between the page scope and session scope. Page scope data is only created and used when that particular page is generated, but session scope holds the data for the whole session. Now let's change the scope one more time, and let's set this scope to application, and similarly let's set this scope to application, and refresh here. We probably need to restart the let's restart the server. Actually, not sure. Yeah. And we clean the state, so that should remove the previous session scope bins. And let's run this again. Okay, it goes back to the original default background, and same thing here, and same thing here. Okay, now let's set a property again. Let's say we set blue. Let's say we set blue. So this changes the color to purple, and if we remove the request parameter, it remains blue. And the reason why it remains blue is because the bin is stored in application scope, so the blue component is still in the application scope. Now, if we go to bgcolor2 and do a refresh, notice that bgcolor2 also have the same purple color because it's sharing the same bin with bgcolor.jsp in the application scope. And if we refresh here, you can see that this one also turns purple because application scope is the same for everybody, not just for the same session. So even though this browser is on a different session as this browser, they have access to the same application scope bin, and the same application scope bin now have both red and blue components, which makes this purple color. So as you can see from this example, depending on where you store your data, in which scope, the data is shared at different levels. Sometimes it's within the same session, sometimes it's across the whole application, and sometimes it's just for one page. Now, there's a slight difference between the request scope and the page scope. And when we look at just individual JSPs like this, they are actually the same thing because each page is used to respond to each request. Later on, when we talk about, for example, the model view controller architecture, we'll see that when a request comes in, the request can pass through several parts of your web application. For example, it may be first processed by a servlet, and then the servlet may pass the request to a JSP for the JSP to generate the response. And for those type of situations, the page scope would have a different meaning from a request scope. A request scope meaning that across this chain of processing, the data will remain valid, and page scope, again, is only valid within that current page. So there is some difference between request and page, and later on, once we get to the part where we use multiple servlets or JSP to process the request, we'll see the difference there. And we already know that to access application scope in servlet, you use servlet context, set attribute, get attribute, and similarly for session, it's set attribute, get attribute on HTTP session. For request and page scope, there are something similar. So for request scope, it's set attribute, get attribute on HTTP servlet request, and for page scope is page context, set attribute, get attribute. So this is the end of the story about Java beans. We'll talk more next time.